Hello friends, Kurt Bergland here with my Monday book review. Every Monday morning at 10 Central, I give you a baseball book review. Could be fiction, could be nonfiction, could be out of print, could be hot off the presses, or it could be something somewhere in between. And that's what we've got today. It's Bill James' book on the Hall of Fame. Whatever Happened to the Hall of Fame? It was originally published as The Politics of Glory. If you get it in hardcover, that is probably what the title will be, The Politics of Glory, 1994-95. Copyright dates with Fireside Books as the publisher. If you're like me, over the past few years, the Harold Baines election to the Baseball Hall of Fame has brought out, well, I'm going to call him Facebook Guy. And Facebook Guy is the one who joins every group he can on Facebook to say that the Harold Baines selection to the Hall of Fame is a bad one. And not only that, but the only people that should be in the Hall of Fame are Ty Cobb, Babe Ruth, and maybe Walter Johnson. Other than that, nobody should be in. Well, there's variations on the Facebook Guy theme, but one of the things that Facebook Guy ignores and that Bill James, even in 1994 and 95, does not ignore is sort of a modern bias against the modern player. And so if you're a baseball fan, you probably know that we have gluts of baseball players from the 20s and the 30s in the Hall of Fame. We have gluts of players from the 50s, but certainly the 60s in the Hall of Fame. But we don't have a lot of modern contemporary players, last 30, 40, 50 years or so. Well, Bill James adds something to that discussion. And even though part of this book is dated, some of the information is a little bit dated, he does have some very interesting things to say that I think still hold up about some certain individual players. Minnie Minoso, one of them, Negro Leagues players in general, another, and some individuals. Ken Boyer, he spends some time, a chapter on the election of Phil Rizzuto, which was sort of the Harold Baines election of its time. Back in, I think it was 91, when Rizzuto was, someone can correct me in the comments below. What Bill James attempts to do is two things that are really, I think, really interesting beyond the comments about the players that are nearly in, should be in. Really interesting chapter on Catfish Hunter versus Louis Tiant, I think still holds up. But he's doing two things that I think are really important. One is he's reconsidering who's doing the electing for the Hall of Fame, and I think he makes some interesting arguments there. And the second thing he does that I think is really interesting is he tries to establish some criteria that we should use to consider whether players ought to be in the Hall of Fame. And this brings me back to Harold Baines. And so if you look at his criteria and you think about that relative to Baines, I think it's an interesting thought experiment. And then you apply his criteria, which have changed since 94, and he's updated those a little bit, but it's still interesting to think about the application of some specific criteria as deciding who the players are, the most deserving players should be that are in the Hall of Fame. And he comes to the conclusion with Rizzuto, who was so controversial back in the early 90s and late 80s when his election was being discussed, is that Rizzuto, if he's elected, won't be the worst player in the Hall of Fame. The same can be said about Baines. In fact, I would argue, given the time period that Baines played in, it's just nice to have some representation of that time period. Maybe they got it wrong a little bit, but Baines was not the least deserving Hall of Famer that's in there. In fact, I think there's a pretty strong case to make that Harold Baines is better than an awful lot of people currently in the Hall of Fame. And unless you're one of these Babe Ruth, Ty Cobb, and Walter Johnson people on Facebook, you're interested in looking at a little bit larger group of Hall of Famers. Bill James eventually breaks them down into Type A, Type B, Type C, Type D Hall of Famers, and I think that's an interesting argument to make. So, the book is Whatever Happened to the Hall of Fame. Many interesting chapters. It is more than 25 years old. It is a little bit dated, but it is an interesting read. And it's also very cheap to pick up. It's available for less than $10 online and probably at your local used bookstore. Bill James, Whatever Happened to the Hall of Fame, or The Politics of Glory. Please subscribe to my channel if you have not. There's lots more coming next year. I'm taking next Monday off. So next book review will be January 3rd, 2022. Monday morning, January 3rd, 2022 at 10 a.m. Central. So subscribe to get your updates. Thank you so much. I appreciate your help in keeping my channel going. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful holiday and a Happy New Year. So long, everybody.